Today I want to talk about The Pale Emperor by Marilyn Manson. I want to focus on how this album marked a shift in his sound, where he started to move away from industrial and decided to experiment with some different sounds. This was his 9th studio album and it was released on January 15th, 2015, also celebrating 10 years. Now, do I really need to wait until January 15th to post this, or can I break the rules and release it early? I'm going to release it now. No need to wait. I've already recorded it, so let's go. But let me also say that I went into this album as a newcomer. I wasn't really interested in the album when it came out back in 2015. But since I was a fan of his latest album, I became much more interested in this artist. So I listened to the album, I did my research, and here are my findings. Basically, this album moved away from his industrial sound and moved towards a blues rock sound. One thing that helped him achieve this was his collaborations with other artists. The album was produced by Tyler Bates, his first time working with him. And if you don't know, Tyler Bates is known for his work with action movies, such as the John Wick movies. But as for music, he's worked mostly with Manson, Jerry Cantrell, and Bush. I think Manson and Tyler Bates had a good chemistry because many of the vocal takes used were his first takes. This was different than the recording process for albums like The High and the Low and Born Villain, where the recording process was more troublesome, although I am a fan of The High and the Low. Another thing that made this album unique was the fact that Manson focused on melody. The album was also shorter than Born Villain, so it had a good pace. Then there were the lyrics. All the lyrics came from a single notebook, as opposed to other albums where it came from up to 20 different notebooks. When he wrote the lyrics, his aim was to write them as himself and not try to express himself through other characters, as he has done in the past. Manson also used more of a stripped-down vocal approach and a different key on this album than any of his other previous releases. He also produced the album under his own record label called Hell, Etc., which gave him more creative freedom. There were a few other factors that shaped this sound. One was the fact that he blended a lot of different genres, such as blues rock, glam rock, and post-punk. This album also had a very prominent, thick bass guitar throughout most of the songs. There are also a lot of clean guitar tones, as opposed to the distorted industrial guitar riffs. Unlike typical metal songs, there isn't much distortion in the guitars. The keyboards add a haunting feel. Some songs have a southern rock feel, while others have a post-punk influence. There are also elements of 70s glam rock with the foot-stomping rhythms. I found it interesting because I remember noticing the same thing from his most recent album from 2024 as well. I also noticed that the songs tend to be structured in a very unique way, with less emphasis on traditional hooks. On this album, he sounds like Jim Morrison on a few of the tracks. This stripped-down vocal approach was much different compared to his previous albums, which were considered to be overproduced. The lyrics also focus on melody rather than using extended metaphors or characters. The lyrics are often repetitive, but Manson changes how he delivers them throughout the songs. Production was also very different. The album did not have the band's usual industrial production, as they opted for a more stripped-down sound. The production was also described as seamless because of the unconventional studio environment, with Manson improvising vocals and Bates working with the music. This album incorporated a number of different musical genres. The first one was the blues. He was inspired by Muddy Waters when he recorded the album, though I think it's a strange combination. Somehow he makes it work. Then there was his inspiration from The Doors. It was interesting because when I first listened to this album, I was taking notes, just listening to the songs, and I jotted down the name Jim Morrison a few times. But then when I went and I did my research on the album, I found that he listed the 1971 album LA Woman as an influence. So I found that interesting. I also found he was inspired by the Rolling Stones, although I didn't pick that up upon my first listen. But one thing I really noticed was the influence of glam rock from the 70s. I mentioned that multiple times in my notes, and I'll get to that later. And when I did my research, I didn't see it mentioned by any other reviewers, and the same can be said with post-punk. It was something that I heard in the sound. And by the way, he didn't completely abandon the industrial sound. There was one song that was very industrial, and a few others where you can hear the subtle influences. The critics generally responded positively to The Pale Emperor. Many publications referred to The Pale Emperor as the band's best album in over a decade, while some suggested it was their best since Mechanical Animals. Many critics mentioned musical diversity, songwriting quality, and maturity. The album was also praised for its conciseness. One critic noted that Manson was able to deliver his message effectively in a shorter period of time. Some critics praised the album's focus on songwriting as opposed to shock value, and noted that Manson was able to create catchy hooks. There were also comparisons to Antichrist Superstar. There was one critic that said The Pale Emperor was like Antichrist Superstar, as it was best to listen to front to back. Other critics said that his vocal performance was described as inspired. Though most reviewers were positive, there were some mixed reviews. One critic said that the album was not a classic, but it complemented the reduced emphasis on shock value. Some noticed a lack of consistency, and the album was lazy when it could get away with it. Many publications included The Pale Emperor on the year-end list, with several ranking it as one of the best albums of 2015. So, for example, Rolling Stone ranked it at 34 of the top 50 albums of 2015. And also one of the best metal albums of 2015. So let's go track by track to finish this off. Opening track, Killing Strangers. We got the thick bass guitar, slow rhythm. This one reminded me of glam rock from the 70s. The overall tone was very creepy, and the lyrics seem to be about guns and how America likes to go to war. The lyrics are repetitive and minimalistic, and it doesn't sound like metal. There's no distortion in the guitars. The keyboards in the background give it a haunting feel. And this was the first time I noticed that him sounding like Jim Morrison, which I put in my notes. Then we have Deep Six. This one has a slow rhythm, some thick and heavy bass guitar notes, and the guitar has a cleaner tone. This one is where I felt it gave it a southern rock feel, had a faster rhythm. He brings in an industrial sounding guitar riff, and it sounded like something you would hear on a typical Rammstein album. So this was where he doesn't abandon his industrial sound. The lyrics were not easy to interpret, but one thing interesting, he says, you want to know what Zeus said to Narcissus? And I heard some post-punk influence on the song. The lyrics are repetitive, but he changes how he delivers them throughout the song. This was one of the singles, third day of a 7-day binge. This begins with a thick bass guitar sound, and it sounds a lot like the post-punk of the 80s. Another one with the lyrics that are not easy to interpret, but the song title kind of tells you what you need to know, I guess. As the other songs, the lyrics are repetitive. Another song that uses more of a rock guitar tone. And the song is very dark, but that's to be expected, and he does some of his screaming vocals that we know him for. Then we have the Mephistopheles of Los Angeles. And the song has a very spacey atmosphere. It has the thick bass guitar, which is very prominent through the album. We have the clean guitar tone. The lyrics used interesting wordplay. For example, the chorus says, "Are we fated, faithful, or fatal?" And it has that foot-slumping rhythm like I was mentioning like throughout this video. Worship My Wreck was a slow and haunting track. Lots of creepy sounds with keyboards, and the lyrics were strange, not easy to interpret. There's one line he says, "You're a paper doll, I'll fold you how I want." So that makes it sound like a controlling relationship. And another song that doesn't sound like metal, it sounds like a very dark gothic rock song with electronic elements. Then we have Slave Only Dreams to Be King, and this one starts with a sound clip. It sounds like a religious preacher speaking to a crowd, and this one sounds, again, more like an industrial song, but it has that glam rock beat and uses more distorted guitars, and the vocals are darker and heavier. So in my research, I found that some of the lyrics are inspired by James Allen from his piece, The Effect of Thought and Circumstance. And this is another one of the examples where he's still doing industrial because he's using those sound clips, but it's one of those rare cases on this album. Then we have The Devil Beneath My Feet. Another one, I keep saying this, but that foot-stomping drum beat and the thick bass guitar sound, that's what we hear on most of this album. It's very interesting. They bring in the distorted guitars after the first few seconds, and this one also has the post-punk influence. Not a bad song. Then we have Birds of Hell Awaiting. This one has some creepy sounds in the intro, then it goes into that thick and distorted bass guitar. And it's another song with haunting keyboards and dark themes. This is another one where I put in my notes that he sounded like Jim Morrison. And he also repeats the phrase, "This ain't no phoenix, baby." And I think that implies because of the lyrics, death is final and there won't be any rising from the ashes. So again, all speculation. This is another single, "Cupid Carries a Gun." It's dark and haunting, and the lyrics seem to be about search for love and belonging. The lyrics are dark and repetitive, and it does have that same drum beat, and also has some acoustic guitars. That was a nice surprise. Then we have "Odds of Even," another song that was slow, dark, jazzy, and it had a faint industrial drum beat in the background. Also the longer song, and this is the last song, by the way, and it has some psychedelic tones as well. So to wrap this up, in conclusion, it was an interesting album. It came out at a time when I wasn't really interested in the artist, but I decided to review it. It's the 10th anniversary, and also because I was interested in Marilyn Manson, because I was a big fan of his 2024 album, One Assassination on the Guard, Chapter 1. That one ended up very high on my end of the year list. But I think this one is a very unique album in his discography. I wouldn't say it holds up to his classics from the late 90s and early 2000s, but it's interesting if you're looking for something that's dark and haunting, but not necessarily a heavy metal album. But anyway, check out my review of One Assassination Under God Chapter 1. Please give the video a like. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.